Welcome to a deep dive, where we take your sources and unpack them to find the really interesting insights.
Think of it as cutting through the noise, getting to the core of what's important and, well, maybe surprising.
Absolutely. And today, we're diving into Saint Kitts and Nevis, the smallest country in the Western Hemisphere.
Our source is a historical document you provided, a guide through, centuries of change on these two islands.
Our mission, to explore its past, from its very earliest people right up to modern nationhood. We want to understand the forces that shaped this nation and the unique challenges it navigates today.
It's a really rich history, definitely, full of dramatic shifts and, some surprising details.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even begin with this story?
We have to start at the absolute beginning, really, setting the scene for St. Kitts and Nevis long before any Europeans arrived.
Right, way before any written history. So what does the archaeology actually tell us about who was there first?
Well, your source points to the Arawak peoples as the earliest settlers we know of. They arrived by canoe, possibly as far back as 3,000 or even 2,000 years ago.
Wow.
And they weren't just passing through. They brought foundational elements of settled life, things like pottery, agriculture, and, evidence of ceremonial practices.
They were really building a civilization there.
Exactly. Then, a bit later, maybe between 1,000 and 500 CE, the Caribs, who were also known as Kalinago, arrived, possibly from Venezuela. Yeah. And early European accounts, well, they describe them as warrior people who either drove out or perhaps assimilated the Arawaks.
But there's a bit of a twist, isn't there? The archaeology doesn't quite mesh with those later accounts of the European arrival.
That's one of those fascinating points the source brings up. The archaeological evidence actually suggests the islands were largely, empty of native peoples by the time Columbus showed up in 1493.
Huh. So it leaves a question about that gap. What happened in those final centuries before Europeans?
It really does, and it's pretty striking when you think about it. 1,400 years of Amerindian history on these islands, and zero written record from them. It just underscores how vital archaeology is. Everything we think we know about their lives, their beliefs, their culture, comes from the material record. Artifacts, burial sites, those incredible rock carvings you can see in museums.
You mentioned their cultural practices. What kind of things did they seem to value?
This source describes carvings of animals and nature, which really suggests a deep spiritual connection to the natural world. Their religion seems linked to nature deities, and knowledge of nature was highly revered, especially for agriculture, obviously. Rituals, tobacco burning, even specific pilgrimage routes are hinted at in the findings.
And details like the cave burials, what do they tell us?
That strongly points to animistic beliefs and a really deep respect for ancestors. They also had quite sophisticated pottery used for food storage and rituals. The source even mentions something interesting, the ceremonial degradation of tumblers. Some people interpret that as showing an awareness of how fragile food security could be. And things like, canoe sculptures and stone zoomorphs animal figures suggest there was probably some social differentiation within their societies, too.
So complex societies, definitely not just basic survival. And they were involved in trade.
Absolutely. An agricultural surplus, well, that allows for commerce, doesn't it?
Right.
The source notes archaeological evidence right there at Old Road Bay showing imported goods that predate any European contact. That suggests established trade routes connecting St. Kitts all the way to places like Puerto Rico, Cuba, maybe even Mexico.
That's a much wider network than you might initially picture for a small island chain. What else do we know about their social life?
Your source touches on creation myths, like people emerging from caves or a night god figure. It describes their deities as omnipresent and compatible, suggesting a maybe less hierarchical, more integrated spiritual view tied to nature. Rituals included medicine, tobacco burning, feasts, and ancestor respect was clearly central, hence the cave burials. There are still big unknowns, though things like pre-conquest nursing practices, formal legal systems, or the exact nature of their warfare.
Okay.
Interestingly, it mentions wanful and annulments were common, suggesting maybe flexible marriage customs. But the extent of slavery among Amerindians themselves, well, that isn't clear from the record.
And Nevis had his own unique evidence, didn't it?
Yes, Nevis holds some really important clues. rock engravings, burial sites, these large storage jars found in caves, particularly around Hamilton and the hot springs area.
Mm-hmm.
Pottery and ornaments have been found at specific spots like Cottle's estate, and ritual masks decorated with bones, they seem linked to initiation or puberty rites. There's even a theory, based on some ambiguous representations, that might suggest a kind of mixing of identities, possibly involving Taino influences going way back, like 2 millennia ago.
So a really rich, complex history that, well, it leaves us with a lot of questions because there are no written records from that time. And then, of course, everything changes fundamentally with the arrival of Europeans.
It really does. Christopher Columbus arrives on his second voyage in 1493.
What was his first impression? What did he note down?
Well, he immediately saw the strategic value, those prominent peaks, great for navigation references.
Huh.
He also noted the islands were fertile. And a fun little detail, he apparently mistook smoke from native villages for smoke coming from the mountains themselves.
Ah.
Which is why he describes St. Kitts as smoky.
And he claimed them for Spain, obviously.
He named them San Cristobal y Nieves. St. Christopher in Snows, roughly. But Spain, well, they were much more focused on larger territories, places with gold elsewhere in the Americas, so they never actually established a permanent, lasting settlement there.
So the islands were kind of left relatively open for other European powers to eye up.
Essentially, yeah. Nearly 100 years passed before other nations really turned their attention seriously to these islands.
Which led to the first successful settlements, but not just one nation at first, was it?
Right. It was a bit of a scramble. In 1625, the English established a settlement in the southern part of St. Kitts.
Okay.
Almost at the exact same time, the French settled the northern part of the very same island, same year, 1625.
Wow, that must have made things pretty complicated right from the start.
It certainly set the stage. It led pretty quickly to the Treaty of Concordia in 1628, which formally drew a boundary, basically dividing St. Kitts between the English and French zones.
And what about Nevis?
The English established their second successful settlement on Nevis, also in 1628. These early divisions, well, they were later formalized more broadly across the Leeward Islands by the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1660.
So these treaties carved up the islands between the European powers.
Yeah.
And your source makes a really crucial point about what these treaties didn't cover.
This is absolutely key. While these agreements helped manage potential conflict between the English and French on the islands, they did not prohibit the slave trade. Not at all.
Which just paved the way for the next devastating chapter.
Exactly. Both the English and the French immediately began importing thousands upon thousands of enslaved people from Africa. This was to fuel what would become the primary economic engine for centuries: sugar production.
So eventually the British assume full control, and sugar just becomes everything.
Yes. Britain consolidated its control over both islands, and sugar plantations became the absolute foundation of the economy. There wasn't much else.
How did they get the sheer amount of labor needed for this massive undertaking? Sugar is incredibly labor-intensive.
Well, initially they tried using surplus labor from other colonies, places like Bermuda maybe, but it was just nowhere near enough for the scale of sugar production they had in mind.
And that's where the horrific transatlantic slave trade comes into the picture.
Tragically and brutally, yes. Your source estimates something like 225,000 enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to Saint Kitts and Nevis over the decades. A huge number for such small islands.
The archaeology even shows this shift, doesn't it?
It does, quite clearly. The material record shows two distinct phases. You have the earlier, smaller settlement construction phase, and then a really dramatic change marked by the arrival of a capture ship, a slave ship, in 1640. That moment really signifies the start of the large-scale plantation system, driven entirely by enslaved labor.
Sugar and enslaved labor were just fundamentally inseparable.
Completely. They became the entire economic basis. This led to the commoditization, the standardization, and eventually the globalization of sugar itself.
The numbers you mentioned really drive home the scale of the human cost. 5,500 enslaved people on St. Kitts, 2,600 on Nevis, just at the peak in the 1820s.
It really highlights the intensity of the system and the immense, unimaginable trauma of enslavement and the Middle Passage journey for every single person forced to endure it.
Yet, somehow, from this horrific experience, a new culture began to emerge.
That's such a powerful part of the story. A distinct African-Caribbean culture, music, religion, language. It began to develop on the islands. It was an act of creating identity, finding community amidst just immense oppression, indigenizing their experience, as the source puts it. The source also notes the development of separate provision cultivation estates, which were basically there to grow food to supply the main sugar plantations.
Okay, here's where your source says it gets really interesting. All this expansion, building plantations, buying people, it required huge amounts of investment, right?
It absolutely did. Establishing new plantations, purchasing enslaved labor, importing supplies, it all needed massive capital.
Right.
The source points to a significant rise in lending right there on the islands in the late 1770s and early 1780s. This brought in an influx of new, often less wealthy investors.
And this created tension with the older established clan families.
Exactly. It created real conflicts of interest. You had these new, often local or less elite, free moneylenders coming in, clashing with the entrenched, wealthy, often foreign-based planters. Your source mentions specific debates over proposals for things like loan companies, George W. Morton versus powerful figures like William Matthews and William Smith. It was a real clash.
A clash between emerging financial interests and the old guard.
Pretty much. But despite the opposition from the established planters, 2 acts were eventually passed, establishing loan and mutual insurance companies in Baster and Charlestown. So the new structures did get put in place.
And the physical transformation of the islands themselves for sugar production must have been immense.
Oh, incredibly demanding. The source details the laborious process clearing land in these sharp valleys, hacking down mangroves, removing rocks from coastal plains, all using fire, sweeps, and overwhelmingly enslaved labor.
Right.
Some of this labor was even brought from places like highland Brazil, apparently because they were used to working difficult terrain. And those rocks, the ones painstakingly grubbed out of the ground, you can still see them today, embedded in the soil, forming walls and fence posts, a lasting physical mark of that forced labor.
So by the 18th and 19th centuries, the society was just fundamentally shaped by this system.
Absolutely. The black enslaved population and their developing African Caribbean culture were the overwhelming demographic reality. They vastly outnumbered the white population.
And this led to the development of a unique language as well.
Yes, a Creole vernacular language developed. While it obviously had European roots, it developed its own distinct grammar and structure. It was different from Standard English and also different from what some contemporary publications condescendingly called Negro language. This linguistic reality kind of mirrored the 3 main social strata the source describes. You had the Englishmen, the Creoles of European descent born on the islands, and then the blacks of African descent.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the anti-slavery movement was gathering steam.
Yes, by the early 19th century, slavery was becoming intensely debated. The British Quaker Communities Campaign, which started way back in the 1790s, using petitions, pamphlets, lectures, some even translated for the Caribbean, that was gaining significant public support in Britain.
Were there any local efforts on the islands themselves to try and improve conditions for the enslaved?
Well, the local assembly did pass some acts attempting to, quote, ameliorate conditions. And they legalized manumission, which allowed a very small number of enslaved people to buy or be granted their freedom. These measures were periodically renewed, but honestly, they only affected a tiny fraction of the population. It wasn't systemic change.
And the white population dynamic was changing somewhat too.
Your source notes an inflow of white Europeans, not just planters, but also vagrants, small merchants often looking for quick wealth. Many didn't find it and disappeared. This era also saw a kind of decline among the traditional notables, the established planter families who engage in specific social activities like pleasure boating.
The economic thinking was also evolving, wasn't it? Moving towards ideas like free labor.
Right. There was this growing argument, particularly back in Britain, that slavery was inherently inefficient, that it brought disorder. This contrasted with the emerging capitalist ideas of free labor and competition. The deep irony, of course, is that planters often extorted funds from the treasury to prop up the slave system. And while the government might propose reforms, they usually expected the planters themselves to bear the costs, which they resisted.
So wealth inequality wasn't just present, it was absolutely foundational to the whole system.
Completely defining. Wealth was incredibly concentrated in the hands of a few planter families whose entire fortunes were tied directly to sugar and enslaved people. The vast majority of the population was economically dependent on them.
And this gave the planters immense political power, too.
The source states they had effective hegemony. They indirectly controlled the government, which often acted squarely in their interests, like proactively protecting the sugar industry, or even reassigning public land to wealthy individuals for new plantations.
Wow.
It sounds like favors were pretty common in appointing judges and other officers, many of whom were financially dependent on the planters anyway. This meant wealthy individuals could often easily evade legal issues or taxes.
And access to education, to knowledge, was deliberately restricted.
For the majority, yes. High illiteracy rates were the norm. There was very little access to books or knowledge. Your source actually argues the government exploited this lack of awareness, maintaining a ridiculously low number of qualified voters, just 536 across both islands in 1780.
536.
Yeah, despite a much larger white and landowning population who theoretically could have qualified under the property rules, it kept power tightly concentrated.
But there was opposition to this entrenched system.
Oh, yes. There was significant opposition to the planters keeping the masses down. Initiatives were launched for things like professional education, and a public library was established in the capital.
Okay.
And an interesting argument emerged against this oppression. Some people started arguing it would actually be better to educate the masses so their political activity and understanding would align more closely with the elites. The thinking was that large, ignorant, unrepresented groups might actually be a greater threat to stability in the long run.
Beyond the sugar plantations themselves, what other economic activities were happening?
Well, linked industries did develop, things like rum distillation, a direct byproduct of sugar shipbuilding, and some raw sugar refining. Nevis, with its favorable ports, apparently flourished commercially for a time. Capital was accumulated not just from sugar, but through lavish living, gambling, and, of course, the horrific trade in human lives and goods.
But the economy faced a sharp decline after abolition finally came.
It's a severe decline. The source really highlights the uneven development that followed, the persistent land ownership inequality, and the continued economic dominance of the established merchant and planter class, even after emancipation. Infrastructure remained tied to the colonial past, and sometimes inappropriate financial assets were provided by global organizations, which didn't really help local needs. Agitation by laborers for better conditions was often met with harsh fines or imprisonment. This led to what the source calls the disarticulation of estate claims, basically disrupting traditional land use patterns, which fueled emigration as people understandably sought better opportunities elsewhere.
And Nevis seems to have been hit particularly hard by this post-emancipation depression.
Yes, the source specifically points that out. Nevis suffered more. It had lower value properties, older farming tools, more accumulated debt, a struggling cotton system that had been introduced, and a real shortage of workers as people left. Emigration intensified there in the 1870s, even with tariffs put in place to try and stop it.
St. Kitts saw some slightly different developments, though.
They did. The Saint Kitts railway line was actually extended onto newly acquired public lands. Mechanization also helped transform some estates into more sort of urban-like operations along the coast. There was a works program funded by loans that supported things like furniture factories and even a gas factory.
Okay.
Yet despite these projects, the islands still held some of the highest negative financial balances in the entire Caribbean. Cultivating sweet potatoes did help reduce reliance on food imports, and amazingly, sugarcane cultivation actually continued right into the 1960s on St. Kitts. Ultimately, though, the overall decline in agriculture closed off many alternative economic opportunities for people.
So by the early 19th century, the stage was clearly set. The end of slavery was becoming inevitable.
The system was facing immense pressure, both from within the islands and certainly from without. The debates raging in Europe and the Americas, fueled by campaigns like the British Quakers, had reached a fever pitch.
And that led directly to the 1833 Act of Parliament.
Yes, the Imperial Parliament in London passed the act, making the transatlantic slave trade illegal once and for all, and effectively ending the enslavement of those who had been most recently imported, though not everyone immediately.
Right, and then came May 1st, 1834, a hugely significant date.
It is often referred to as friendly emancipation, though the reality was complex. Your source notes it was met with great relief by the former slaves, understandably.
What was the immediate impact on the islands? What happened right after?
It was profound. The source says former slaves immediately began experimenting with their newfound freedom, moving, trying different work, setting up small businesses. This led almost immediately to a rapid and significant decline in the volume of sugar production. The workforce just wasn't there in the same captive way.
The planters' reaction sounds predictable, almost defensive.
Absolutely. They reacted by clamoring for the abolition of any resistance or labor laws that had emerged post-emancipation. Their ability to maintain the cheap, controllable labor supply they needed proved incredibly fragile without the chains of slavery.
So sugar production really plummeted.
By 1840, just 6 years later, production was actually lower than it had been before abolition. The economic and social systems were fundamentally and permanently altered. While planters made attempts to recover or deny the impact of emancipation, these largely failed. New labor sources were eventually sought, often indentured labor from elsewhere. An economic crisis hit around 1846, leading to widespread panic and often, frankly, counterproductive efforts by the authorities to deal with the resulting poverty and dislocation.
The relationship between the former masters and the newly freed people sounds incredibly tense.
Well, the source characterizes the old master-slave relationship as being marked by the master's constant, deep-seated fear of rebellion.
Right.
After slavery ended, those fears of the laboring classes didn't just disappear. The government implemented new domestic policies specifically aimed at control and ensuring stability. This often meant government agents continued to intrude harshly into people's daily lives, actively trying to limit the liberties of the formerly enslaved population.
But the laborers themselves had very clear goals for what freedom meant to them.
Yes, absolutely. Their aspirations were fundamentally about freedom from the backbreaking, often brutal agricultural drudgery of the plantations, and freedom from constant state interference in their lives. They deeply desired land of their own. And significantly, many believed the state, the government, was actually responsible for providing that land to them.
So abolition truly triggered sweeping social change, not just legal change.
It really did. Immediate freedom meant the formerly enslaved could begin building lives away from the immediate confines of the plantation structure. They started acquiring livestock, building their own houses, digging wells, setting up small shops, planting provisions for themselves, and contributing to community assets like school and roads, building communities.
And there was a noticeable shift in where people lived, a geographical shift.
Yes, the source mentions that many permanent sugar workers left the plantations altogether. They moved into the hills and mountains, areas the source describes as having been dormant previously, but holding potential for small farming and independent living.
The planters didn't lose all their power and privileges overnight, though, did they?
No, certainly not immediately. Abolition did bring recognition of the right to negotiate wages, but these wages remained extremely low. The wage labor system was seen by the planters and authorities as essential to try and keep the sugar industry staggering along.
Right.
And while workers could now technically reside and farm on former estate land, they were often confined by specific restrictive conditions. And importantly, they generally couldn't occupy the houses that were still owned by their former masters.
This period also saw a real acceleration of political change and, inevitably, unrest.
Absolutely. The source draws a direct line from the labor unrest and the burgeoning social movements demanding racial justice and equality to the growing push for a more inclusive democracy and concrete plans for governmental reform.
A major shift in how the islands would actually be governed.
Yes, it marked a turning point. For the first time in the region's history, there was widespread acceptance of the idea of representative government, as opposed to just direct control by white British appointees sent from London.
Official records describe this as a sort of gradual, managed process.
That's the tone you get from the official records, yes. While the transformation was undeniably happening, it was often presented cautiously. They adopted terms from something called a Commission of Quiet Inquiry back in 1839. A system of what they called diffuse representation was introduced.
Okay.
This extended the right to vote indirectly through property qualifications and so on to about 1,200 people across the islands. But these were still primarily the white planters, merchants, and landowners.
So still not genuinely representative of the vast majority of the population.
Not even close. The acts were passed partly perhaps to accommodate the new reality, but also partly out of a deep-seated fear of social disorder. The source explicitly notes that the white councils, the ruling bodies, were constantly aware of the potential for an armed revolt. That threat never left their calculations.
And those core challenges from the immediate post-abolition era, the desire for land, the frustration they persisted.
Oh, definitely. The deep desire for land and the belief that the state was responsible for providing it remained powerful forces. This fueled widespread discontent throughout the 1840s and beyond.
And on top of all this internal pressure, the sugar industry faced a major new external threat.
A really significant one. You had this massive expansion of sugar beet cultivation happening in Europe, particularly in France, Germany, Russia.
Competition.
Huge competition. Prussia and North Germany alone increased their sugar beet production by over 240% in this period. This European competition, combined with British policies that actually favored refining lump raw sugars in England and restricted imports of unrefined sugar unless it came from British possessions, put Caribbean cane sugar at a massive disadvantage in its primary market.
So against this really complex backdrop, deep historical change, economic pressure, social unrest, local movements started pushing hard for actual independence in the late 1940s and early 1950s.
Yes, this was absolutely part of that larger global wave of decolonization that swept the world after World War II. People on the islands began actively, vocally agitating for the end of colonial rule.
Who were some of the key groups driving this?
Well, the first local organization specifically focused on independence was the Progressive Labor Movement, formed back in 1948. Then, in 1949, the colony was granted limited self-government, a step, yes, but definitely not the end goal for many. Other crucial parties, like the Saint Kitts and Nevis Labor Party and the People's Action Movement, emerged as key players in this push.
And at this time, Saint Kitts Nevis was still formally a UK colony and part of the short-lived West Indies Federation.
That's right. After years of sustained pressure from these local groups, and also helped by a change in the government back in the UK, the British finally presented a proposed constitution in 1964.
Which, as I recall from the source, wasn't exactly embraced locally.
No, not at all. Local organizations felt it was far too paternalistic. The proposed chief minister's role was very limited, and the British High Commissioner retained significant control over key areas like finance and policing. It wasn't real self-determination.
So this rejection led to more protests and demonstrations.
It did. Demonstrations, like the ones mentioned at Point and Nag's Head, really helped galvanize public opinion and mobilize the political parties against that 1964 proposal. The continuation of nonviolent pro-independence demonstrations kept the pressure on constantly. This eventually led to the acceptance of a new proposal in 1967.
Which granted self-governing status for internal affairs. A big step.
The crucial step forward, yes. While the UK still held control over external things like immigration and defense, the islands gained significant autonomy over their own internal matters, laws, finances, administration.
But the ultimate goal of full independence remained firmly in sight.
Absolutely. A formal declaration for full independence was made in 1968. This initiated serious negotiations in London that ran from June 1968 right through into July 1969. The Self-Government Constitution Order was officially passed in July 69.
What was happening with Anguilla during this period? They were part of the grouping initially.
Right. Anguilla actually had an unsuccessful attempt to separate entirely during this time. After a period of political turmoil, it eventually became a separate UK dependency in 1980, leaving Saint Kitts and Nevis to proceed together.
And Saint Kitts and Nevis achieved full political independence when?
That landmark moment finally arrived in September 1983. Your source interestingly describes the transition as happening with gross nonviolence, suggesting it was a relatively peaceful process compared to some other decolonization struggles around the world.
Looking back slightly, the source mentioned there were earlier, maybe weaker, attempts at self-governance even before World War II.
That's true. They had tried things like forming an elected legislative council and seeking representation directly in London. But the colonial administration often pushed back quite hard, sometimes even flouting its own laws against mass meetings to suppress dissent.
So the post-World War II period really seems to be the turning point where grassroots movements gained unstoppable momentum.
Absolutely. The 1945 restructuring, whatever its intent, definitely spurred significant grassroots energy and action. And crucially, at that point, the colonial authorities seemed to tacitly sanction or at least tolerate some of this political organizing in a way they hadn't before.
The St. Kitts Nevis Anguilla Labor Party was the most prominent voice in this.
Yes, it emerged as the most vocal and active movement pushing for change. It was founded in June 1951 and led initially by Dr. E.M. Boss Dorset.
And were there specific incidents that acted as sparks, galvanizing people?
Your source highlights a couple. Resentment over proposed tax on gifts led to a significant protest meeting. But perhaps more famously, widespread anger over a tax imposed on short staple cotton led to what became known as the Calypso demonstration.
Okay.
Apparently, eggs and tomatoes were thrown at a government secretary, a Mr. St. C. Chiverton. Arrests followed, people named Swearing and Cicero were charged, and many historians see this particular event as a key catalyst that really galvanized the broader independence movement.
Even a visit from a U.S. president apparently played a role.
According to the source, yes. President Kennedy's visit in 1963 did seem to spark political developments, particularly influencing the thinking and activism of the younger generation.
Which led to the formation of new political groups and increased pressure for democratic change.
Precisely. The ULP, the United Labor Party, was formed in 1966, bringing together unions, youth groups, and other factions. Youth marches and demonstrations were apparently particularly effective in pressuring the government for a much broader right to vote, moving beyond the old property qualifications.
And the result was universal adult suffrage, a huge democratic milestone.
Yes, a major, major victory. The new franchise granted the right to vote to all men and women aged 21 and over, regardless of property ownership.
This must have had a significant impact on the political landscape and elections.
A huge impact. The ULP, benefiting from this wider electorate, saw overwhelming success. They won the Advisory Council elections in 1967 and then secured all 5 contested seats in 1968 following recommendations from the British Battenberg Commission.
And this electoral success paved the way for further constitutional changes towards full self-governance.
Yes, the new constitution that came into effect brought in universal adult suffrage, formally, established a House of Assembly with elected representatives, created a cabinet system of government, and gave the local government the right to enact its own laws and manage its own finances and enterprises.
Were there still safeguards for British interest?
Yes, some safeguards remained. The governor, representing the crown, still had the prerogative to call in forces to maintain order, for example. But it was undeniably a massive step towards local control.
The first assembly meeting under this new system was in 1969. And the momentum towards full independence just kept building through the 70s.
It did. Your source mentions the Prime Minister visiting Canada in 1974 specifically to negotiate aspects of independence, and a draft constitution being formally presented to Britain later that same year. Independence Day was finally proclaimed for September 19, 1983, marked symbolically by the raising of the new national flag beneath the departing Union Jack. A powerful moment of transition.
What were some of the tangible developments happening on the ground in the years leading up to that final step to independence, building the nation, so to speak?
The source lists quite a few significant infrastructure projects during that period. A new airport capable of handling larger planes, improvements to roads, upgrades to utilities like electricity and water, a new hospital, a prison, new schools, a teacher training college, and even a university that became a leading institution in the Caribbean.
Wow.
There were also new projects focused specifically on housing, irrigation for agriculture, and improving primary education.
So even before 1983, they had built a lot of the necessary framework and infrastructure of a modern nation-state.
They certainly had. Constitutionally, they remained a legally dependent territory of the UK until that final day. But the 1967 self-governing status had already given them substantial internal control, even while London retained power over key areas like immigration and foreign affairs.
There was also that earlier failed attempt at a larger regional grouping, the British Caribbean Federation.
Ah, yes, the Federation of the West Indies, which lasted from 1958 to 1962. Saint Kitts and Nevis joined it in February 1958. And according to your source, their government actually supported it, despite facing significant economic difficulties at the time.
What did being part of that federation actually mean for them in practice?
Well, theoretically, it meant being part of a larger regional integrated market, having a single federal currency, and dealing with internal federal taxation. However, the source rather bluntly calls the situation for them within the Federation recessional and ruinous at times, even mentioning a loss of human resources from the islands to federal administration. Despite this, they pursued it with what the source calls great hope, but ultimately the Federation collapsed.
And the failure of that wider federation undoubtedly influenced their subsequent path towards their own independence.
It certainly informed the debates, yes. Post-World War II, as the UK began offering independence to various territories, St. Kitts and Nevis was sort of keeping pace constitutionally, seeking a more appropriate system of local government. The experience and failure of the Federation definitely shaped ideas about regional cooperation versus national sovereignty.
After independence was achieved, the Constitution itself specifically recognized the unique two-island structure of the new nation.
Yes, the 1984 Constitution is quite significant in that regard. It explicitly establishes St. Christopher, St. Kitts, and Nevis as two distinct but politically equal nations within the Federation. That structure is key.
The lead-up to the final independence vote in 1983 wasn't entirely smooth sailing, though, was it? There was some controversy.
Yeah, your source mentions controversy surrounding a proposed referendum on independence plan for June 1st, 1983. It notes a general abhorrence for referenda among some political figures, the lingering sense of the unfinished business of federation, and particularly the outcomes of specific debates within Nevis about its place in the new structure. Proposals for alternative arrangements, like maybe equal partnerships with former Federation members, were apparently rejected, which led to accusations of it being a blame game.
And there were issues with communication and maybe political messaging during this crucial period.
The source notes that the government at the time had a near monopoly on communication channels, like radio, and a persistent ambivalence or uncertainty about the exact path forward seemed to put the ruling party on the defensive at times.
But pro-independence voices found other ways to get their message across to the public.
Apparently so. Pro-independence cartoonists, for instance, allied themselves with Nevisian independence petitioners. They used visual media, cartoons, to articulate a vision of a potentially powerful, unified federation, drawing on ideas of oneness with other Caribbean islands.
And the United Nations played a role in supporting the move.
The UN did support the idea of undiluted independence. Though, interestingly, the source describes this support somewhat cynically as applying a band-aid for dear life, perhaps suggesting that everyone knew the challenges facing the new nation were still immense, regardless of UN blessing.
Thomas A. Robinson's announcement back in 1967 confirming the UK's acceptance of self-government sounds like it was a really dramatic, pivotal moment.
The source describes it vividly, saying it rocked the territory and forever changed the course of its history. This announcement came right after a delegation from the islands had visited London to present the local assembly's own proposals for self-government. Robinson framed it not just as a step, but as a profound challenge, a challenge to win and then defend their freedom. He even warned against losing freedom later, referencing Cuba negatively as an example.
He really urged them to be prepared for what was coming.
Exactly. He pushed the local representatives to see the opportunities, the potential for a better life, full self-government, increased responsibility as choices to be embraced, not threats to be feared. He cautioned against romanticizing the colonial past and directly questioned their readiness, urging them to act wisely so history couldn't say they knew not or prepared unwisely.
He even connected the whole struggle to higher ideals like Christian values.
Yes, interestingly, he linked the fight for progress explicitly to ideals like love, striving for one's neighbor, justice, liberty, welfare, and knowledge. He also presciently noted the need for safeguards for all political parties in the future, acknowledging the divisions. And he emphasized the importance of continuity and stability during the transition. He even predicted that St. Kitts would eventually be de-affiliated from some of its existing local provisions, perhaps foreseeing future constitutional adjustments.
So the post-independence political scene has really been marked by this legacy and by continued, sometimes rapid change.
The source describes it as a period of unprecedented change, requiring daring leadership at times.
Early governments after independence faced significant challenges.
Yes, the first government under Premier Foreman faced challenges that eventually led to the rise of a strong opposition led by Sir Simeon Daniel, particularly focused on Nevisian interests.
And then came the long tenure of Sir Kennedy Simmons and the People's Action Movement, or PAM.
Correct. His PAM government held power for a remarkable 17 years, but they faced major tests along the way, including having to stave off a coup attempt in October 1992 and dealing with various political scandals that emerged.
The Saint Kitts and Nevis Labour Party, the SKNLP, eventually made a comeback.
Yes, under the leadership of Dr. Denzil Douglas, they managed to end PAM's long reign in the 1995 elections.
And the Douglas government faced its own set of difficulties during its time in power.
Indeed. The source mentions specific challenges like countering the negative international impact of the tragic murder of 6 tourists in 2000 and broader economic challenges. Plans to stimulate the economy, for example through gastronomy tourism, reportedly failed due partly to strong political opposition.
The 2004 elections seem to have been a really significant turning point, marking the end of Dr. Douglas's first decade in power.
Yes, after 10 years as prime minister, he suffered what the source calls a shocking defeat. This apparently came after a proposed constitutional referendum was defeated, and significantly following revelations reported in the source regarding Dr. Douglas's dubious finances.
So Pam returned to power under Simmons again.
Yes, and according to the source, they managed to withstand challenges from a weakened SKNLP in the subsequent elections, holding on to power for another period.
What happened within the SKNLP after that major 2004 defeat? There was internal conflict.
The source notes significant internal conflict under the leadership of a figure named Russell. It describes a tension between youth factions and the more experienced party members. This apparently led to an attempt to remove Russell from leadership, a split within the party, and ultimately something rather dramatically described as a youth-led revolution that essentially reinstated a cabinet style similar to Dr. Douglas's previous governments. Politics there sounds quite dynamic.
The roots of these modern political parties go deep, don't they? Back to those colonial labor struggles and riots.
That's what your source really emphasizes. Those early worker strikes and the unrest during British colonization weren't just isolated incidents. They were foundational moments that directly catalyzed the formation of the various political groups that evolved into today's parties.
And today, two main parties tend to dominate the political landscape.
Primarily, yes. You have the Saint Kitts and Nevis Labour Party, SKNLP, and the Concerned Citizens Movement, CCM, which is predominantly based in Nevis and represents Nevisian interests strongly.
The SKNLP has a very long history, stretching back to 1932.
It does, but its modern political strength and shape were significantly influenced by figures like Dr. Sir Kennedy A. Simmons. He's notable, as the source points out, for being the youngest ever Commonwealth Prime Minister when he first took office. He later resigned from the SKNLP due to internal disputes before going on to lead the rival PAM party. The source also notes, neutrally, that the SKNLP has faced accusations over the years, including allegations of favoritism and banning certain entities from government contracts during its periods in power.
Who leads the SKNLP today, according to your source?
The source highlights Dr. Terence Michael Drew. He's described as youthful, a diplomat by background, and acclaimed. Interestingly, it notes he grew up in Ponds Extension near Caron, an area historically linked to sugar workers. His platform included promises like creating new jobs, canceling certain debts, raising wages, and even providing rice.
And were there criticisms leveled against his leadership or government?
Your source does note criticism from the opposition regarding the hiring of foreigners, allegedly to replace long-tenured local staff in civil service, public sector, and post office positions.
And the CCM, the main party in Nevis.
It's led by Sean Michael Richards, who has previously served as Premier of the Nevis Island Administration and also as a Federal Minister of Telecommunications and Transport. Their platform, as described by the source, focuses largely on curing the ills that they attribute to the SKNLP's previous decade in power. So, a clear opposition stance.
The media landscape sounds quite lively as well.
The source paints a picture of a media environment dominated by fiery rhetoric, furious repartees, and quick quips. It specifically highlights broadcast journalist Anne Marie Johnson as a prominent figure known for this style. Sounds like exciting listening.
How does the actual electoral system work? How are elections run?
Elections are managed by a dedicated elections office and an electoral commission, all overseen by an elections supervisor. The system is based on universal adult suffrage. Everyone over 21 can vote. It uses a first-past-the-post system in each constituency, meaning the candidate with the most votes wins the seat, even if it's not an absolute majority.
What's the general timeline for an election?
Well, Nomination Day, when candidates are formally registered, is announced by the Governor General. It has to be between 28 and 56 days before the actual election day. Voter registration lists are finalized after Nomination Day is announced. Election Day itself is also proclaimed by the Governor General, with polls typically open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. The final results are then announced by official proclamation.
How is representation determined in the National Assembly?
There are 11 representatives elected from constituencies across both islands, plus one additional representative specifically from Nevis, reflecting its unique status. The leaders of the political parties that win the most elected seats become the Prime Minister at the federal level and the Premier for the Nevis Island administration. Any other parties with seats form the official opposition.
And what's the Governor General's role in this structure?
The Governor General, who represents the British monarch as head of state, is formally elected by the Assembly. They have specific constitutional duties, including, importantly, acting in the event of the Prime Minister's dismissal or resignation.
The Constitution's federal and division define the overall framework.
Yes, exactly. They outline the rights of citizens and the specific powers and responsibilities of the Assembly, the legislature, the government, the executive, and the courts. the judiciary. The government and its cabinet are responsible for enforcing laws and exercising executive power.
And your source notes a pattern of the main parties alternating in power over the years.
Yes, it suggests that the two main parties, SKNLP and PAMCCM, tend to alternate in government. Elections are constitutionally mandated to be held every 5 years, and the timing is set by a rather specific formula. The first Tuesday following the first Monday in August after the full moon.
That is precise.
Isn't it? Quite unique.
Okay, shifting gears entirely now, let's talk about the economy. We've touched upon its history, so heavily dominated by agriculture, especially sugar. But today the story is vastly different.
It's seen a truly massive transformation. Historically, yes, it was utterly dependent on agriculture salt initially, then overwhelmingly sugar right from the earliest colonial days. But that agricultural base has been steadily declining since the late 20th century. Now, tourism is undeniably the major economic engine.
Sugar was king for so long, centuries.
It really was. Established way back in the early 17th century, it was an incredibly profitable crop for the planters and for Britain. It grew drastically in the late colonial era and was the main source of income for hundreds of years. It attracted significant foreign investment, but it also made the island's economy extremely vulnerable to global price swings.
When did the decline really set in?
The decline began seriously in the 19th century, tied to the debates around slavery and then emancipation itself. It was hit incredibly hard by the price crash during the Great Depression in the 1930s. There was a bit of a resurgence or expansion in the 1950s and 60s, encouraged by tariffs and protectionist policies, with European overseers even being brought in. But the final collapse really happened through the 1970s into the 90s, largely driven by migration away from the demanding and low-paid work in the sugar industry.
Is there any commercial agriculture left today, besides maybe some remnants of sugar?
Your source says that technically sugar remains the only significant commercial crop, though some fruits and vegetables have been introduced more recently, presumably for local consumption and maybe some tourism use, but not on a large industrial scale.
The banana industry is given as a specific example of the challenges that agriculture faced, isn't it?
Yes, it's a perfect illustration of that vulnerability. The banana industry was heavily reliant on preferential export agreements with the UK. This made it extremely vulnerable to price fluctuations and policy changes. Initially, UK tariffs actually inflated the price for Saint Kitts bananas, making them a significant contributor to the economy.
But that changed.
It did. When international trade cases eventually opened the UK market to bananas from other regions, particularly Latin America in the late 90s and early 2000s, it caused severe price compression. St. Kitts bananas simply couldn't compete on price alone, and the industry suffered badly.
And tourism has now completely eclipsed agriculture in economic importance.
Completely. By 2019, your source states tourism was the single most notable income generator, contributing over 90%, maybe even more, of the country's gross domestic product, GDP. That is a truly dramatic economic shift.
This massive shift towards tourism, does it have any historical roots, or is it entirely modern?
Well, the source suggests the tradition of people traveling to the islands actually goes back centuries. European powers were attracted partly due to the island's history and strategic location. So there's a long history of outsiders visiting.
But modern, large-scale tourism really took off after independence in 1983.
Yes, post-independence, increased direct air routes from North America and Europe, and crucially, the rise of the cruise ship industry were key drivers. Beach resorts and hotels started opening much more widely across both islands by the late 20th century.
Cruise ships seem like a particularly huge part of the current tourism picture.
They are definitely a major component, especially bringing large numbers of passengers directly into the port of Basse-Terre on St. Kitts. This influx contributes significantly to the growth of related tourism areas like spa and wellness services, gastronomy, restaurants and local food experiences, and cultural heritage tourism visiting historical sites like Brimstone Hill. By the early 2000s, the islands were actively marketing their unique combination of biodiversity and protected natural sites alongside health and wellness services like spas.
And development in the tourism sector continues today.
Yes, there's been continuous growth and investment. Your source specifically mentions a major new resort project replacing older businesses, planning around 800 rooms with island-style architecture and amenities. The airport has also been upgraded significantly to handle larger planes and increased air traffic, which is essential for supporting tourism growth.
But there's a distinct downside to this heavy reliance on the tourism model, particularly the resort model, which the source highlights.
A significant one, yes. The dependence on large resort hotels, especially those with foreign ownership, which many are, often leads to what's called wealth flight, or economic leakage.
Meaning the money doesn't stay locally.
Exactly. Unlike the old plantation estates, which, for all their evils, were focused on local agricultural production and reinvestment, albeit for the owners, a large portion of the wealth generated by many modern resorts doesn't necessarily stay circulating within the island's economy. Profits often go overseas.
And what's the impact of that wealth leaving the country?
It increases dependence on foreign imports for food, supplies, everything the resorts need. It can contribute to macroeconomic imbalances. And ironically, it can further contract the local agriculture sector, as there's less incentive or capital for local production if resorts are importing everything. It's this challenging paradox. The primary growth sector, while bringing in jobs and revenue, also potentially weakens some foundational elements of the local economy and increases external dependency.
Let's turn now to the vibrant cultural heritage of Saint Kitts and Nevis. The source describes a really lively scene.
It certainly does. Dance, music, and big celebrations are absolutely central to life on the islands.
Steel pan music is highlighted as being particularly iconic.
Oh, it's a staple across the Caribbean, isn't it?
Wow.
Originating in Trinidad and Tobago, probably in the early 20th century, famously from tuned oil barrels. It started out among underprivileged youth, even faced attempts by authorities to ban it back in the day, but proved totally irrepressible. Today, it's globally recognized, completely intrinsic to Caribbean culture, and has even spawned various musical subgenres.
Are there any particularly famous local steel pan bands mentioned?
Your source names the Bewitched Steel Orchestra as a real standout, apparently holding a record of 12 consecutive Panorama Championship wins, which is incredible. SSG Steel Pan Stars and Elite are also mentioned, alongside numerous school bands, church groups, and community organizations that keep the tradition alive.
Saint Kitts and Nevis has earned a reputation as a festival island.
That's clearly thanks to the sheer number of festivals celebrated throughout the entire year. It's not just one big event.
Carnival is the biggest and most popular of them all, though.
Absolutely. Its origins are fascinatingly mixed. You have a European festival, maybe pre-Lenten, introduced by the colonial aristocracy, but this quickly became adapted and deeply entwined with African rituals and traditions brought by the enslaved people. Elements like rum, ecstatic dancing, elaborate costumes, masquerades, mass, drumming, music, street plays, jouvert, these were part of both traditions in different ways, creating this unique, vibrant fusion. Though the source notes some specific traditions have inevitably been lost or reborn as Carnival has matured over the centuries.
When exactly is Carnival held? What are the main events?
It typically runs from early December through Fat Tuesday, encompassing 3 weekends leading up to Lent. Key events include the Christmas festival, which features lights, parades, bands, and street parties. Then there's Jouvert Morning, a very early morning street party on the last Monday before Ash Wednesday that apparently draws thousands of people into the streets.
Yeah.
And finally, Road March on the final day, Fat Tuesday itself, which is described as a huge explosion of tradition, culture, gaiety, involving locals, visitors, and cruise ship passengers altogether. The core activities remain broadly consistent year to year, but the focus or specific additions might change.
What about other festivals besides Carnival?
There's Culturama, which specifically celebrates Nevis's distinct culture. There's a French festival acknowledging that historical connection, a Birdwatchers festival highlighting the natural environment, and of course Independence Day celebrations, plus many others throughout the year.
And the music scene goes well beyond just steel pan.
Oh, incredibly diverse. The source lists calypso, reggae, soca, folk music, gospel, traditional brass and string bands, powering a type of Christmas music, informal jam sessions, and even something called honkin' parties, described as a neo-traditional spin. Music clearly flourishes in schools, churches, and communities through concerts, jamborees, competitions, even things like Jutney Fests and quiz nights incorporating music. Festival sharing and performance are highly valued parts of the culture. There are also island-specific festivals, some sponsored by the tourism industry, focusing on things like jazz or folk dance weeks.
Carnival itself has evolved quite a bit over the last couple of decades.
Yes, the source says it's been consciously redefined and expanded, generating year-round ancillary events now, things like steel band practice yards, calypso tents where performers hone their songs, and parade preparations that go on for months. The calypso-centric element seems particularly strong in the Kittian and Nevisian Carnival. It mentions an almost opera house-sized tent for the main calypso competitions, with thousands of dollars in prize money attracting over 20 performers and maybe 10 bands. The source also mentions modern elements like official flag-raising ceremonies, organized street jump-ups, and even parade automation being introduced.
Moving on to cuisine and local traditions, what are some classic dishes you'd find?
Your source lists several traditional mainstays: stewed saltfish, a Caribbean classic; steamed fish, dishes made with cornmeal. Plantains are everywhere, of course. These are often served alongside rice and peas, fresh salads, and fried or boiled potatoes or other root vegetables,
Sure.
ground provisions.
What about for special occasions?
For special events, heartier dishes often appear, like cow heel soup or a rich conch stew. And for dessert, coconut tart is mentioned as a favorite.
And other sweet treats.
Sounds good.
Definitely. Coconut sweet cake, the dense, rum-soaked black cake, especially at Christmas. Something called salara, described as doughy, coconut bread, and pastries called patsy are all mentioned as popular local sweets. Do specific dishes align strongly with particular holidays or events?
Yes, some are traditionally prepared specifically for Christmas or Easter. During tourist-focused days or festivals, special cultural meals are often featured at select restaurants or venues. Some meals seem to be consistent staples for any kind of celebration, while others are really tied only to very specific special occasions.
Are there any culinary details specific to the Mass celebration, the main carnival time?
Ham is generally prepared during Mass time, apparently. And an interesting, perhaps slightly alarming detail: islanders reportedly drink around 60 gallons of rum per person during the carnival period.
60 gallons.
That's what the source says. Maybe an exaggeration, but it paints a picture. It also adds a charming detail. People in their 90s traditionally stick to drinking red sweet wine during the festivities.
So local traditions, culinary and otherwise, remain very firmly entrenched.
Very much so. They're celebrated as key parts of the cultural heritage. Using native ingredients is important in baking things like cake or pudding stick, in stews, in various doughs.
What about historical fashion? What do people wear?
Your source notes that really elaborate body adornments were typically reserved for the wealthy elite or perhaps ladies of the night. For most people, outward displays of wealth, especially for special occasions, focused on colorful clothing. It mentions bandana material called seisei and brightly colored dress shirts that might be specially tailored for an event and perhaps only worn once, then discarded. Head coverings like parlors and turbans were common, worn both for decoration and practically for protection from the hot sun. Interestingly, there was apparently a formal dress code at one point prohibiting dresses above the knees, which some elite women deliberately flouted as a statement.
Are there large-scale decorations put up for carnival?
Yes, massive landscape decorations are produced specifically for the parades. These apparently start going up across the islands 8 to 12 weeks before carnival actually begins, everywhere except the racetrack, the source notes.
And there's a really unique, almost quirky carnival tradition mentioned involving sugar mills.
This one sounds quite specific and fun. An annual feature is the tradition of trying to climb the old sugar mills in the very early hours of Carnival Monday morning, supposedly while the miller is still asleep. If you fail in your attempt, you're considered cuckoo, sort of foolish or unlucky for the rest of the day. Apparently, parties even formed to try and symbolically steal the mills from rival neighborhoods. And joining the wrong party, trying to steal the wrong mill, is considered a major social faux pas. It's a very unique local twist on holiday revelry and community rivalry.
Let's shift now, unfortunately, to more serious matters, the environmental challenges facing the islands. Your source points to some really critical issues needing urgent attention.
It does. It highlights what it calls precarious alterations to the climate and the local environment. These are being driven primarily by two main factors. Firstly, an ongoing quarrying program, which is actively modifying the landscape, particularly on Nevis. And secondly, the broader accelerating impact of global climate change.
Sea level rise is identified as a particularly significant threat for these low-lying islands.
A major existential threat, really. Projections for the coming decade show rising sea levels threatening the natural environment, critical infrastructure like roads and coastal buildings, and the very tourism resources the economy now depends on, things like freshwater supplies, beaches, and coastal biodiversity like coral reefs.
What are some of the wider environmental issues mentioned?
Coastal erosion is a big one, obviously linked to sea level rise and stronger storms, the general degradation of ecosystems, both marine and terrestrial, and the increasing problem of invasive species disrupting native flora and fauna. Your source stresses the real urgency here, stating that just a few decades could bring environmental tragedies that fundamentally change Navisian history forever.
Wow.
It adds pointedly that addressing this plight is also a matter of global equity, requiring serious international financial commitment from the richer nations primarily responsible for climate change.
There seems to be a fundamental tension, though, between the tourism-driven economy and the need for environmental protection.
This is a key paradox your source brings out. Tourism is now the primary growth sector, and it's heavily supported by state-funded infrastructure roads, ports, the airport. But the absolutely crucial role of the natural environment in providing the attractions that tourists come for, the beautiful beaches, the reefs for diving, the rainforests for hiking, is often overlooked or undervalued in development planning. Much more conservation effort is needed.
Are there conservation groups active on the islands trying to address this?
Yes, NGOs dedicated to conservation do exist, but their scope, according to the source, is often limited, perhaps focusing on smaller projects or single ecosystems, like protecting a particular species of frog or restoring a specific section of coral reef. Your source suggests there's a need for larger, more integrated conservation efforts that can address the varied environmental needs across the islands, covering flora and fauna, and terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems comprehensively.
Focusing specifically on the impacts of climate change, how is the Caribbean region as a whole experiencing this?
The source is very clear. The entire region, comprising some 30 island nations, is directly on the front lines of climate change effects. Rising seawater temperatures are causing widespread coral bleaching, which devastates the marine ecosystems that support both tourism and local fisheries. It's also led to a noticeable decrease in fish populations, with some species, like sardines, reportedly disappearing entirely from the waters between certain islands.
And hurricanes are also linked to these rising temperatures.
Yes, warmer atmospheric temperatures provide more energy for storms, contributing to increased hurricane strength and intensity. The source notes that the past 15 years have seen particularly fierce and very costly hurricanes hitting the region, causing substantial damage to infrastructure and agriculture across many islands, including Saint Kitts and Nevis.
And agriculture, what little remains, is directly impacted by the changing climate too.
Definitely. Higher average temperatures and altered rainfall patterns, sometimes more intense rain, sometimes longer droughts, are driving the spread of pests and crop diseases like blights. Increased risk of floods also damages crops. All of this threatens local food supplies and the livelihoods of those still involved in farming.
Prevention of the worst impacts really requires a global effort, doesn't it?
The source strongly emphasizes that. Preventing the most catastrophic climate change impacts can only be fully achieved through international cooperation and commitment. Locally, Saint Kitts and Nevis faces challenges like insufficient resources for intervention and enforcement issues like poaching. The source mentions Saint Kitts only having one fisheries officer at the time of writing, though plans to recruit more were noted. There's also a constant need for increased public awareness about the limits of marine resources.
As a small independent nation, are there significant financial constraints on environmental protection efforts?
Your source suggests that Saint Kitts and Nevis hasn't always had the financial resources needed for extensive environmental protection programs or dedicated research and development. However, since gaining sovereignty, they have taken important steps. The source mentions efforts to preserve remaining rainforests, protect coral reefs, and manage the historical Brimstone Hill Fortress National Park, which also has ecological value.
And accessing foreign assistance helps bridge some of that funding gap.
Yes, absolutely. Being part of the global community has allowed them to access international aid and technical assistance for environmental projects. Your source specifically mentions a project back in 1997 that used foreign funds to develop national climate change risk management plans. This included a national coastal vulnerability assessment and a sea level rise strategy, complete with detailed vulnerability maps identifying high-risk areas.
Rising sea levels continue to be a major and increasing threat for all small islands.
It's a critical ongoing challenge. Small island developing states, SIDs, like Saint Kitts and Nevis, often face unique difficulties in addressing it, things like inadequate local data, sometimes unclear lines of responsibility for implementing countermeasures, and crucially, a chronic lack of funding for the large-scale research and adaptation measures that are needed.
Storm surges associated with hurricanes and other storms are also a major cause of coastal damage.
Yes, particularly from hurricanes, but also from powerful northeastern storms that affect the region. An interesting nuance from your source. While the strength of hurricanes may be increasing due to warmer temperatures, the overall frequency or intensity of significant tropical cyclones impacting the region hasn't dramatically changed, according to the data cited. This suggests more research is needed on exactly how projected future conditions will affect storm surges specifically. It also raises the challenging question of needing potentially much larger scale coastal architecture solutions, seawalls, engineered beaches, etc., which are incredibly expensive.
Okay, let's wrap up our deep dive by looking at Saint Kitts and Nevis's place in the wider world today, its international relations and global position.
Right. It's an active participant in a wide range of regional and global organizations. Your source lists membership in key bodies like the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, ECCB, CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, the Association of Caribbean States, ACS, the United Nations, UN, the Organization of American States, OAS, the Commonwealth, and the Caribbean Development Bank, CDB. Nevis also holds associate membership in CARIFORUM, which deals with EU relations.
They seem acutely aware of their vulnerability as a small island state on the global stage.
The source definitely notes a sense of anxiety about their vulnerability to international economic and political developments. They clearly see benefit in belonging to associations of other small states where they can have a collective voice.
What's been driving their push for economic diversification, moving beyond just sugar and bananas?
A major impetus was the loss of those preferential trade arrangements, particularly with the UK and Europe, for their traditional exports like sugar and bananas. That created real urgency to diversify the economy into new sectors, primarily tourism, but also financial services and, more recently, information technology. This is alongside the ever-present need to find ways to better manage and mitigate the threats posed by natural hazards like hurricanes and sea level rise.
Their relationship with the United States is specifically highlighted in the source.
Yes, it's described as an expanding partnership. Cooperation includes security initiatives like the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, CBSI, U.S. support for strengthening the justice sector, and bilateral economic engagement focused on promoting trade and investment. The U.S. has also provided assistance in reshaping the economy towards these new sectors. Newer areas of cooperation mentioned include trade facilitation, improving citizen security, and assistance with developing a national strategic development plan. They also actively seek U.S. technical expertise to help build national capacity to assess, manage, and respond effectively to regional challenges.
They're also party to many multilateral treaties on various issues.
Yes, covering important areas like narcotic control, counterterrorism, and crucially, anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing, AML-CFT, which is vital for their financial services sector. They have a mutual legal assistance treaty, MLAT, with the U.S., allowing for information exchange and cooperative investigation and prosecution of financial crimes. Plus, they're part of numerous other trade and cooperation agreements through CARICOM with Canada, within the CSME framework, the WTO, and other bilateral and regional partnerships.
Regional cooperation through CARICOM seems particularly important for them.
Saint Kitts and Nevis is described as an active associate member of CARICOM. They participate in formulating and executing policies aimed at regional cooperation across a broad spectrum: economic integration, trade policy, transportation, social development, justice and governance reforms, foreign policy coordination, and regional security efforts. The goal of these supporting bodies and institutions is to foster sustainable growth, promote social equity, and preserve democratic principles across the Caribbean.
And they are specifically committed to the CARICOM Single Market and Economy, CSME initiative.
Yes. CSME integration is stated as a priority. It's conceived as a broad framework designed to enhance the quality of life for citizens across the region through economic growth, greater equity, and preserving the environment. A key part of this involves breaking down remaining barriers, physical, monetary, fiscal, to allow for the free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor throughout the member states. This includes removing tariffs and establishing rights for businesses to set up and provide services across borders.
Are there specific obligations that come with CSME membership?
Yes, the source mentions several. These include harmonizing taxation related to international traffic, aligning legislation on things like audiovisual services, competition policy, and consumer protection. The target date for achieving free movement of goods, services, and capital was originally set for 2005, though implementation is ongoing. It also covers complex issues around the mobility of persons for paid employment and the supply of services by non-nationals, often referred to as Mode 4 service supply.
And the CSME framework is legally binding on member states.
Your source states that it is indeed binding and requires member states to align their national laws accordingly. There are also provisions for a consultative committee and even a tribunal to handle cases of noncompliance and provide remedies or potential sanctions. Addressing noncompliance is crucial to prevent the whole system from being undermined.
Beyond the Caribbean region, they also prioritize building strategic global partnerships.
Definitely, especially in key areas relevant to their future. Tackling climate change, fostering digital innovation, improving health outcomes, enhancing national and regional security, and promoting social inclusivity. Federal cooperation, working together as Saint Kitts and Nevis, is seen as essential for bringing tangible benefits from these partnerships.
Your source identifies one global partnership as being particularly important.
Yes, it explicitly highlights their long-standing alliance with the Republic of China, commonly known as Taiwan. The source details a wide range of benefits stemming from this relationship: development assistance, technical cooperation in various fields, public health support, scholarships for students, Taiwanese investment in the islands, trade links, and significantly, a shared commitment to democratic values, the rule of law, and fighting global warming.
Taiwan is described in very strong, positive terms in the source material provided.
Yes, the source uses phrases like a free country, a defender of the right to self-determination, free speech, and freedom of the press, and praises Taiwan's proud record of development. This is explicitly contrasted with what the source refers to as Beijing's, the People's Republic of China's, illusory promises.
And the current government has no plans to switch recognition to Beijing.
The source states clearly that the government has no plans to abandon this friendship with Taiwan. It also notes that the Prime Minister has internationally condemned specific actions of the People's Republic of China, mentioning China's disappointments in seeking support within the UN, despite making overtures to countries like Saint Kitts and Nevis.
But they also seek mutually respectful relationships with other global partners beyond Taiwan and the U.S.
Absolutely. The source emphasizes that they seek productive relationships with other global partners in specific areas of mutual interest, things like tourism development, infrastructure projects, accessing indigenous expertise from other nations, boosting trade and investment, technical cooperation, and collaborating on responses to global security challenges. It's about finding pragmatic partnerships that benefit the island's development and security.
We've certainly journeyed through a remarkable and complex history today, from the, somewhat mysterious lives of the ancient Amerindians, through the brutal colonial era built on sugar and enslaved labor, the long fight for abolition and its incredibly complex aftermath, right up to the path to modern nationhood and now the challenges of a tourism-dominated economy.
It really is a story defined by resilience, constant adaptation, and this ongoing negotiation with powerful internal and external forces. You see it everywhere, from the lasting physical marks of plantation labor still visible on the landscape, to the shifting dynamics of global trade that forced economic change, and now the existential threat of climate change. The islands have faced, and continue to face, immense pressures.
And this deep dive, using the source material you provided, really brings to life some of the fundamental questions facing St. Kitts and Nevis today, doesn't it?
It absolutely makes you reflect on what it truly means to be a small island state in the 21st century. How does that specific identity, that specific geopolitical position, shape the decisions its people and its leaders make? How does it distinguish them not just from larger continental nations, but even from other nearby islands with different histories or circumstances?
Right, it's a very unique perspective shaped by scale and history.
Yeah, and given all the global pressures we've discussed, particularly the accelerating impacts of climate change and the volatility of the global economy, they're so reliant on what might the future realistically hold for small island nations like St. Kitts and Nevis. It's a sobering question.
So what does all this tangled history, this complex present reality, actually mean for their journey forward? Where do they go from here?
Well, that's perhaps the biggest question of all. And definitely something for you, the listener, to ponder as you continue your own deep dives into the world.